The fundamental assumption behind any piece of communication is that the person who authored it did so because they actually had something to say. Therefore, when it comes to any piece of literature, whether it be an ancient prophecy or a simple text message, the meaning that is intended to be communicated by its author is necessarily objective. A further assumption would be that the author crafted said communication in such a way as to be understood by their audience. By crafted, I mean encoded into symbols, that is to say, language. And since the meaning of symbols is context dependent, if what you're after is the meaning intended by the author, then the only context that will let you get even close is the context of the author and their intended audience. Fortunately for us as humans, we have a large portion of our neurology dedicated to the processing of language. So the vast complex calculations required to arrive at a reasonable accurate understanding of any set of symbols in their context are all done at the subconscious level, that is beneath one's conscious awareness. But unfortunately, when one is not part of the context of the original audience, then the subconscious processes that allow humans to understand language will act as biases that color one's interpretation. And because these biases are subconscious, they are naturally unexamined and unknown to the interpreter. Thus, as interpreters, we must approach an ancient literary work, like the book of Habakkuk, with great epistemological humility. So for us, being so far removed from the ancient context of the text in question, we need a method of interpretation that allows us to get at the objective meaning intended by the author, and a way of circumventing our unconscious biases. There is only one known method available to humans to attempt to circumvent our biases and approach anything objective. That is the scientific method. Although it will never result in certainty, if done well, it can give us some degree of confidence. The part of the scientific method that involves empirical observation, hypothesizing, experimentation, and the collection of data in the science of literary interpretation, or hermeneutics, is exegesis. And the peer-review portion of the scientific method would be comparing the results of our exegesis of any given text with the reception history of that text. The point of the peer-review portion of the scientific method is to give insight into how much your unconscious biases are affecting your interpretation of the data, and it can clue you into relevant data that you may not have taken into account. And if your experiment and results are repeatable over time, then you can have a degree of confidence in your hypothesis. So, in literary interpretation, if your interpretation is novel, this should result in a very low level of confidence in your conclusions of your exegesis. And generally speaking, if many people from many different contexts arrive at the same conclusion as you, then you can have at least some confidence in your interpretation. And when it comes to looking at the reception history of the text in question, fortunately for us, we have more than 2.5 millennia worth of people translating and writing about this passage, to which to compare our translation and the conclusions of our exegesis. So we are just going to take a very brief look at some ancient translations as well as compare our interpretation to a few quotations of this passage. In part 1, we took a look at the historical, literary, and grammatical contexts of Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. This led to the conclusion that the book of Habakkuk is 2 poems written in the late 7th century BC. The poems deal with the subject of human suffering due to injustice, that is, human evil. The verse in question is in the first of the 2 poems, and is in a section of text that serves as a preface to a prophetic vision. In the vision, Yahweh promises the prophet that all human evil will eventually be dealt with, and he will bring justice to the whole world. Our verse serves to inform the prophet that the righteous are those who trust Yahweh and remain loyal to him, even though in the short term they will endure suffering, specifically at the hands of the invading Babylonian army. In spite of encountering many lexical and syntactical challenges, the greater literary context led us to a fairly literal rendering of this verse into English as, "If there is heedlessness, his soul is displeased with it, but a righteous one, by his faithfulness, will live," the antecedent of his being Yahweh. So we have a situation where we have a fairly high degree of confidence that we know what is meant by this passage, mainly because of the literary context. This point of remaining loyal to Yahweh and trusting Him to be faithful to do what He said is even reiterated in the second poem of the book. But due to the difficulties and the lack of data introducing ambiguity, we have a fairly low level of confidence in our translation. But with the available data, I think this is the best we can do. Speaking of available data, when it comes to ancient manuscripts, the only complete copies of the book of Habakkuk in Hebrew is the Masoretic text. The Masoretes being a group of Jewish scribes that worked between the 7th and 10th centuries to compile an official version of the Hebrew Bible. The oldest existing copy of the Masoretic text is the Aleppo Codex, which is the manuscript we translated from. There are 3 incomplete copies of the book of Habakkuk in Hebrew found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which predate the Aleppo Codex by at least 900 years. One is missing our verse entirely, one only has a few letters from the first line, and the third is actually a late 1st century commentary on only the first poem of the book. Here are the first few words of our verse, and then there is some commentary, and then the rest is missing. What is here, although using a different spelling system for vowels, is similar to what we find in the Masoretic text. This at least tells us that the awkward syntax of the Masoretic text didn't originate with the Masoretes, it predates them by at least several centuries. So perhaps, due to an evil scroll-munching goat, these scrolls don't offer anything that will bring any clarity to the difficulties with this awkward syntax. Let's indulge in some speculation. Given the difficulties with this text as it appears in this manuscript, also assuming its original reading was clearer, let's try and reconstruct how the original might have read. This won't be reckless speculation. We will limit ourselves to only the data available in this manuscript, and we'll give ourselves a couple of very strict and sturdy guardrails. First, since we have a fair amount of confidence that we understand the meaning of this passage, our speculation should make that meaning more clear, or at least not change it at all. And second, our speculation must be easily explained by common human error in the transmission of the text, so we will be limited to what can be explained by common mistakes on the part of the copyists. So looking at this verb, which is the source of most of the difficulties with this verse, in our translation, this is a subordinate clause, and the action of the verb is the subject. So we went with the English ness suffix, and we implied a to be verb, putting this clause in a passive voice. Since this verb is behaving like a noun, we would expect to see a feminine ending, which it has. And since this pronoun referring back to it is masculine singular, this confirms that the feminine ending here is to indicate an abstract concept, and not just for grammatical agreement. Just like the feminine ending on this word in the next line changes the verbal root meaning to be loyal or to be faithful into the noun loyalty or faithfulness. Now, since the action of this verb is intransitive, meaning it has no direct object and describes a state or condition, what we would expect to see instead of the pual verb stem should be the use of the hifil verb stem, or rather the passive form, the hoful stem. So there should be a letter he on the front of this word. This change falls within our 2 guardrails that we established. It brings clarity to the passage, and it is easy to see how someone, when copying this text, might drop this letter he here. And since this word can be spelled with or without the final he, and often doesn't have it, a scribe making a copy may have accidentally migrated this letter over to the end of this word. Or, after writing this one, they skipped to the next letter following this one, which is a common copying mistake called parablepsis. Another issue with this verse, as it appears in this manuscript, is these possessive pronouns here. They are third-person masculine singular, the antecedent being Yahweh. The issue is that in this section of verses 1 through 4, it is Yahweh speaking and introducing the vision of verses 5 through 20. So one would expect these pronouns to be first-person singular. Now, it is actually not uncommon to see abrupt shifts in perspective like this in Hebrew poetry. But it is a little strange to see it here just within a few verses meant as an introduction to a prophetic vision. The difference between the third-person singular masculine pronoun and the first person is just the length of the tail of this letter. At least that is the case in the Aramaic block script that most all existing biblical Hebrew manuscripts are written in. Looking at the way these letters were written in the majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it is easy to see how they may have gotten confused while being copied. So this speculative change also falls within our two guardrails. These changes give us the hypothetical reading of, if there is heedlessness, my soul will be displeased with it, but a righteous one, by my faithfulness, will live. Another way of dealing with the second of these two pronouns is to consider the possibility that it originally was not there. I mentioned in part 1 the possibility of this pronoun referring to the noun a righteous one, but I decided on reading Yahweh as its antecedent, because if what was meant was the loyalty/faithfulness of a righteous one, there would be no need for the pronoun even being here. If we take it out, we get a hypothetical reading for the second line of, but a righteous one, by loyalty/faithfulness, will live. This hypothetical reading also meets our two criteria. Although there is a nuance of distinction between them, they have essentially the same meaning. It is like if one were to proclaim, I believe God is trustworthy, or I trust God. Although there is a difference in emphasis, these two phrases imply each other. It may be a distinction without any real difference. Now we have two hypothetical readings, derived from making inferences from the text we have. Just like if you saw something written in your own language that had common misspellings, you can still easily read it, even though it looks a little off. Even if it were likely that what was intended by the original author was one of these hypothetical readings, we cannot use them to update our translation, because you can't translate what you don't have. There are no known Hebrew manuscripts that read like either of these. The point of this exercise was to simply show that you can infer these variant readings just from what is here in this manuscript. This will be relevant when we take a look at some of the ancient translations of this verse. An important part of the reception history of any text is how it has been translated into different languages over time. Looking at the ancient translations of a text can be helpful, especially in cases when the manuscript evidence is limited, where the syntax is peculiar or difficult, as is the case with our verse. Even though they are only translations, they are much closer to the original in both time and culture. And furthermore, the translators would have had access to much older manuscripts than we have access to. Let's start by looking at the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a collection of translations of the Hebrew Bible and other literature into Koine Greek. It was compiled over the 1st and 2nd centuries BC, with the books of the Pentateuch likely being completed sometime in the late 3rd century BC. It was popular among Greek-speaking Jews and early Christians, and seems for a time to have had a quasi-official status among Jews and Christians in the diaspora. Among the surviving manuscripts, this is how the vast majority of them render our verse into Greek. Now, I won't take the time here to work through a translation. I'll just provide a very strict literal rendering, but I will point out a couple of things that are of interest. First, the first two words form a subordinate conditional clause. E'en is the conditional if. The following verb is an aorist middle subjunctive. The root is from upestello. It means literally to turn away, to hold back from, to shrink from, or to avoid. In a military context, it can mean retreat. But here it is something like turn away in the sense of disregard, to ignore, or as we have rendered the Hebrew, to be heedless. In part 1, I pointed out some possibilities for these two words. I settled on treating them as a subordinate conditional clause, due to that is what just made the most sense, and it is what seems to be what was intended by the Masoretic scribe who put this accent mark on this word. So we see that the translators that created the Septuagint made the same kinds of choices, although they did so without the help of the Masoretic accent marks that wouldn't be added for another 800 years. The second thing I need to point out here is that the Septuagint uses the first person singular pronouns. So this makes the Septuagint a literal translation of our first hypothetical reading. This suggests not just a possibility, but a probability that the Hebrew manuscripts that the translators of the Septuagint were translating from likely read like our first hypothetical. The Septuagint wasn't the only Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures around in ancient times. There was clear efforts to make a Greek translation that more closely followed the text tradition that would become the Masoretic text. There is this scroll, found in the so-called Cave of Horror. It is a Greek translation of the Minor Prophets, although our verse is mostly missing. and there are the translations done by Aquila of Sinope, done in the middle of the 1st century, and one done by Symmachus in the 2nd century. These both use the first-person possessive pronoun in the first line, like the Septuagint, but the third person in the second line, like the Masoretic text. So there was perhaps many Hebrew manuscripts around that had variations when it came to these pronouns. Now looking at a Syriac translation called the Peshitta, done sometime in the 2nd century. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. This version of the Bible is still used in liturgies in many Syriac Christian churches. Here is our verse. This translation is rather paraphrastic. In English, it would be something like, "He takes no pleasure in the unjust, but the righteous will live in faith." Here we have the third-person pronoun in the first line, like the Masoretic text, but no pronoun in the second line, just like our second hypothetical. Moving on, looking at the Vulgate, a Latin translation done by Jerome in the late 4th century. This is our verse in the official version of the Vulgate, adopted by the Roman Catholic Church. This is a very formal equivalent translation of the Masoretic text. We see the use of the third-person pronouns, his soul in the first line and his faith in the second. And due to the literal nature of this translation, this clause that we were reading as a description of Yahweh's disposition towards disloyalty instead sounds like a description of a disloyal or unfaithful person, which is a little different than what we came up with, although the basic contrast of the two lines of the verse is maintained. Now, I wanted to show you a manuscript of the Vulgate, so I found our verse in the Codex Amiatinus, which is from around the year 700, making it a few hundred years older than the Aleppo Codex. This manuscript is interesting because here is the first line of our verse, and then here is the second line. And what we have here in between is an alternative reading for the first line, which actually follows our first hypothetical. So it follows the reading of the Septuagint, not the Masoretic text. We have the initial subordinate conditional clause, and the first-person possessive pronoun. This tells us that Jerome, or a subsequent scribe in the lineage of this manuscript, felt that the Latin reader needed the reading of the Septuagint to help them make sense of this. Some English translations do this as well. For example, the New Living Translation is translated from the Masoretic text, but it has this note on our verse. And as you can see, they supply the Septuagint reading. Now, looking at the Targumim, a Targum is an Aramaic paraphrase/interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. The tradition of using Aramaic Targumim in Jewish liturgy may go back as far as the beginnings of the Second Temple period, when Aramaic had become the lingua franca of the Near East. A very rough literal translation of this would be, "Behold, the wicked in the heart say, there is not all these, but the righteous upon honesty rise." In a little bit better English we get, "Behold, the wicked think all these things are not so, but the righteous shall live by the truth of them." The Targumim were meant to be used in a synagogue as a supplement to the public reading of Scripture, in Jewish communities where Aramaic had supplanted Hebrew as the common language. Due to their paraphrastic nature, there is no way to work back to the underlying Hebrew. But what is preserved is the basic gist of the verse. That is, this contrast between the wicked who do not believe the vision and the righteous who live by trusting that God will indeed do what he said. In fact, this contrast is explicitly expressed in all of these ancient translations, with all of them translating this word as something that means the opposite of loyalty, faithfulness. So we can have even a little bit more confidence that we understand what the author of this literature was trying to say. And also, regardless of the variations in the pronouns, we can see that all these ancient translators made the same kinds of choices that we did in our translation. So there's nothing novel or innovative about ours. So we can afford ourselves just a little bit more confidence in our translation as well. Now, looking at these ancient translations, we learn a few things about our verse. First, the syntactical uncertainty didn't originate with this manuscript or even the Masoretes. It predates them by quite a bit. Second, there probably was at least two text traditions that existed for centuries. One with first-person pronouns and one with third-person pronouns. The latter was eventually adopted by the Masoretes as the official version. And third, in spite of these variations, the meaning of the passage was preserved across all of these different text traditions and across all of these ancient translations. That is to say, no matter which one you're looking at, you can still get the point the author was trying to make. Now, another important part of reception history is considering the way our passage has been commented on and used throughout history. And there's also the traditions that have developed since the book was written, regarding both the literary work itself and the author. As mentioned earlier, we have thousands of years worth of people writing about, arguing about, and using this passage. What we're going to do is just take a brief look at a few literary works that quote this verse. So this is at the end of the Second Temple period. There are other Second Temple works that mention the prophet Habakkuk. There is Bel and the Dragon, in which he appears as a side character in the story. He brings Daniel some food while he's in the lion's den. And in the Lives of the Prophets, which may technically be later than the Second Temple period, but some place it in the 1st century, there the man, Habakkuk, is actually given some biographical information, which is absent from the biblical book. These mentions of Habakkuk, along with the quotes that we're going to look at, tell us that not only was this literary work well known, but that it was popularized to the point that traditions had built up around it. Alright, here is our first quote. This is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that I showed you earlier. It is Pesher Habakkuk. The scroll was one of the first discovered at Qumran in 1947. It is essentially a running commentary on the first poem of the book. So there is a quote of the original passage, followed by the word Pesher, which means something like interpretation, which is then followed by some commentary. And this pattern continues throughout this scroll. What the author of this text is doing is very much like what people in Christian pop culture do today, when they write books which try to link current events to passages in the prophetic literature of the Bible. The author is drawing parallels from the situation of the original writing of the book of Habakkuk to what's going on in Judea during the time of the scroll's composition. So references to the Babylonian Empire are read as referring to the Roman Empire. The prophet and the faithful remnant in Judah of the 7th century BC are the teacher of righteousness and the faithful remnant in Judea in the 1st century. And the unfaithful of Habakkuk's day are the wicked priest and the unfaithful of the 1st century, that is to say, Jewish collaborators with the occupying Romans. Here is the first line of our verse. Then there's the following commentary, which reads something like, "Its interpretation, they will double upon themselves and find no mercy at being judged." Then presumably the second line of our verse, which is missing. Then at the top of the next column we have, "Its interpretation concerns all observing the law in the house of Judah, whom God will free from the house of judgment, on account of their toil and their loyalty to the teacher of righteousness." Now, setting aside the author's application of this biblical text, you can see that they are reading this verse as a contrast between these two, not these two. So they're reading this verse in Habakkuk the same way we are. It is interesting to note that they see those who are unfaithful and turn away from Yahweh as more evil and deserving of judgment than the invading pagan army. Now, moving on to the Apostle Paul. In his epistles that we find in the New Testament, he quotes our verse in two places, although they are only quotations of the second line. We have Galatians 3:11 and Romans 1:17, and as you can see, they both mostly follow the Septuagint, with the exception of the Galatians passage does not have this conjunction, and most notably, they're both missing the first-person pronoun present in the Septuagint, making Paul's two quotations here more in line with our second hypothetical reading, even though they use the exact vocabulary and morphology found in the Septuagint. So what Paul is most likely doing here is using the Septuagint, but making it fit grammatically into the context of his own writing. In an attempt to summarize Paul's usage of Habakkuk 2:4 in both Romans and Galatians, I'll say, Paul is making the case that one is righteous or just in relationship to God when one believes him, that is to say, is loyal to him. So there is a right relationship with God apart from the covenant that he made with the nation of Israel, so apart from Torah. So one can be right with God without having to be a biological descendant of Abraham's grandson, Israel. In both Romans and Galatians, Paul uses Abraham, who lived long before the Torah, as an example of this. He quotes Genesis 15:6. Comparing Genesis 15:6 to our verse, in both the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, you can see they use the same root vocabulary. For righteous and righteousness, we have zadik and zadika in Hebrew, and dikaios and dikaios une in Greek. And for believing loyalty, in Hebrew we have aman and amunah, and then we have in Greek pistis and pisteios. This makes the story of Abraham an excellent example of the principle that is expressed in the second line of our verse, simply that God counts those who have this believing loyalty thing towards him as righteous. Looking at the Romans quotation of our verse, we see Paul is using Habakkuk 2:4 to frame all of the content of the epistle. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 15 is a greeting. Then in verses 16 and 17 we have, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed, from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." And there is the quote of our verse. Here, what the English Standard Version is translating righteous and righteousness is from the same root word, as is the case for both believes and faith. Paul goes on to expound on what he means by this phrase here, from faith for faith. In chapter 3, verse 22, we have, "Dekaios une di theou, dia pistaus, Iasu Christu, ais pontus taus, pisteu antus." The righteousness of God through the believing loyalty of Jesus Christ, for all the believing ones. So for Paul, it is the perfect faithfulness/loyalty of Christ, and thus perfect righteousness, that is imputed or credited to all who have this believing loyalty. Paul is using the principle expressed in Habakkuk 2:4 as the logical foundation for his explanation of the gospel, and pointing out that Christ is the exemplar of this principle. So Paul is reading our verse in Habakkuk, or at least the second line, the same way we are. That is, as a description of those whom God considers righteous. The next quotation from the late 1st century that we're going to look at is also found in the Christian scriptures. It is in the Epistle to the Hebrews. Here, the author of this epistle doesn't just quote Habakkuk 2:4, they also include a bit of verse 3. The quotation, for the most part, follows the Septuagint. I say for the most part because the author has made some very intentional alterations. We have the insertion of the definite article here, and the changing of this verb from an aorist active subjunctive to a future active indicative, and there is the simplifying of this double negative. This changes this line from "it is coming, will be present, and will not delay" to "the coming one will be present and will not delay." A more obvious change is the reversing of these two lines. Another change is the moving of the first person possessive pronoun. This changes this line from "but the righteous by means of my faithfulness will live" to "but my righteous one by means of faithfulness will live." The author of Hebrews is not trying to deceive their readers into thinking this is how Habakkuk 2:4 actually should read. What is happening here is that the author is using this verse from the Septuagint, and like Paul, is fitting it into their own writing. And also like Paul, they are taking this verse as explicitly messianic. That is, they are signaling to the reader that Christ is the fulfillment of Yahweh's promise of justice in the book of Habakkuk, so he's the coming one, and that Christ is also the exemplar of faithfulness, and thus is the righteous one. Now, just as a side note, if you have read this passage in Hebrews 10 in English and compared it to Habakkuk 2:4, you likely notice that these verses don't seem to match at all, regardless of the English version. This is due to the fact that just about all English versions of the Old Testament are translations of the Masoretic text, whereas the passage in Hebrews is translated from a Greek text of the New Testament, which has a modified quote from the Septuagint, which was translated from a Hebrew text that likely differed from the Masoretic text. Now, it is fairly clear that the author of Hebrews is understanding Habakkuk 2:4 the same way we are. In fact, the main point of the entire epistle is this contrast here. It was likely written to Christians during a time of persecution. It was meant to encourage them to remain faithful in spite of suffering, and as a warning against apostasy. Just to point out a few things in the immediate context of this quotation in Hebrews. First is the fact that the author quotes a portion of Habakkuk 2:3 along with verse 4. This tells us that they are reading verse 4 as going with verses 2 through 3, which was one of the first interpretive decisions we made when exegeting this passage in the previous video. Now, immediately after the quotation, the author of Hebrews reiterates and expounds on the contrast found in this verse. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Following that, the author defines the term pistis, which is then followed by a listing of examples of this believing loyalty. Unlike Paul, who only used Abraham as an example, here we have 16 named examples of people who remained loyal in spite of suffering, some not seeing what God promised come to pass in their lifetime. And like Paul, the author of Hebrews points to Christ as one who is perfectly faithful, therefore perfectly righteous, remaining loyal even while being tortured to death. Now, we have run the experiment. That is, we have exegeted Habakkuk 2:4, and we have submitted our conclusions to a kind of peer review. Our peers in this case being the author of Pesher Habakkuk, the Apostle Paul, and the author of Hebrews. And even though all of these pieces of literature are using our verse in slightly different ways, they are all reading it as a contrast between the faithful and unfaithful. So this tells us that our reading of Habakkuk 2:4 is not novel. This gives us even more confidence that we are likely correctly understanding what the author was trying to say. And it is interesting that all three of these ancient authors are reading Habakkuk 2:4 as messianic. As mentioned earlier, we have more than 2,500 years worth of reception history of the book of Habakkuk. We could compare our understanding of chapter 2, verse 4 to every mention of the passage by any rabbi, church father, theologian, scholar, and so on and so forth throughout history. The reason we just looked at ancient translations is, well, they're interesting, and more importantly, they predate the Hebrew manuscript we were translating from. Thus, they are based on much older manuscripts, the hope being that they would give us some insight into the textual difficulties we encountered. From this very terse examination of a portion of the reception history of this verse, we gain slightly more confidence that we have exegeted correctly. And we also see that there is a high probability that Habakkuk 2:4 may have originally read a little differently than what we find in the Masoretic text. But no matter how confident we are that the original may have read like this, we cannot change our translation to match it, simply because you can't translate what you don't have. Even if you have all of these ancient translations and quotes that read like this, there is no existing Hebrew manuscripts that do. It is possible that the Dead Sea Scrolls, if they were more intact, may have. No one would be surprised if they followed one of these alternative readings. Now, since a translation is meant to be a tool for a reader that doesn't know the original language, I think it's appropriate to add this reading to our translation. Just like the Latin manuscript we looked at did. You have a translation of the Masoretic text as it is, and then supplied along with it is a translation that follows the Septuagint reading. We can do a similar thing with our translation by utilizing a footnote. So we can go with something like, Hebrew uncertain, Septuagint reads, "If there is turning away, my soul will not be pleased with it, but the righteous by my faithfulness will live." And I think when it comes to making what the author of the book of Habakkuk was trying to say clear in contemporary English, this is likely the best we can do. And when we go beyond just a little bit of the reception history that we looked at, this interpretation emerges as a consensus view, meaning throughout history it is the norm, and you can even call it the traditional interpretation. Now, I just want to point out a couple of things that are important to consider when comparing your exegesis to the reception history of a text. First, you only want to compare your interpretation of a text with other interpreters that share the same goal. In our case, the goal is to attempt to get as close as we can to the meaning intended by the author. That is, we are treating the text as a piece of communication between the author and their intended audience. So it is an objective thing we are investigating. So those interpretations that are based on a subjective approach to interpretation, i.e. postmodern, will have no value to you and can be ignored. And the second thing, it is helpful to intentionally look at interpretations that differ from your own. An example of a translation that was made with the same goal as us, yet differs from where we arrived at, is the New English Translation, although the meaning it carries is very similar to what we came up with. Look, the one whose desires are not upright will faint from exhaustion, but the person of integrity will live because of his faithfulness. The translators of the NET arrived at this rendering by making different choices than we did along the way, and they are dealing with the difficulties present in the Masoretic text by reading this word as being from a different root. To their credit, the translators, knowing this reading was a bit novel, supplied some notes to explain their choices. Even though this is a novel rendering, their logic is sound and it fits the available data. But the choice of a different root for this word is a bit of a stretch, and lends itself to some skepticism, and its novelty lends itself to a low level of confidence in this rendering. This is just one example of a differing view on this verse. There are, of course, many others. This is where that epistemological humility I mentioned at the start of this video comes in. It is the awareness that because of your own subjectivity and the possibility that you may be lacking relevant knowledge, you will never have certainty. You can only have varying degrees of confidence. Although the arguments made by the NET translators are interesting and worth considering, they don't quite rise to the same level of confidence that we can have in the traditional view. So we can hold them as an interesting possibility and recognize that the traditional interpretation is a little more probable, but all the while being very careful not to presumptuously assert certainty. In the 7th century BC, Yahweh answered a prophet's complaint about suffering due to injustice by promising a future when the justice of God is revealed and there will be perfect justice. But in the immediate future for the prophet and the people of Judah, there will be suffering at the hands of the invading Babylonian army, and they likely won't see the promise come to pass in their lifetime. Verses 2 through 4 of chapter 2 of the book of Habakkuk is an introduction to the vision where Yahweh promises this coming future justice. The prophet is told the promise of justice may seem like it's a long way off. Verse 4 is a contrast between the disloyal, losing faith in Yahweh's promise due to the perceived delay, and those who remain loyal, trusting Yahweh to be faithful to keep his promise, inferring that when this justice finally arrives, it will be the latter that will be counted as righteous. Now, what does this mean for us today? Well, you're not living in Jerusalem in the 7th century BC, so nothing, obviously. That doesn't mean you can't find inspiration in the idea of remaining faithful while enduring suffering, or find hope in Yahweh's promise of eventual justice for the whole world. If you are a Christian, you can read the 2 poems of the book of Habakkuk like the Apostle Paul and the author of Hebrews did. Then the story of the righteous enduring suffering at the hands of the unjust becomes a picture of Christ's suffering, and the promise of this coming perfect justice as being fulfilled in the person of Christ and his return. And also, as expressed in Hebrews, Habakkuk can be a warning to not turn away and be disloyal just because you face some discomfort or hardship.